So I'm pleased to introduce Dustin Wehr, who's going to think about rigorous deductive reasoning applied to socially relevant issues.
So yeah, I showed the title of my talk because I didn't think I would have time to fit in adequate coverage of any of the examples in there without sacrificing some more important things. Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
No, I didn't understand what you just said. Repeat it if you want me to hear.
Are you joking?
No, I didn't hear your first sentence.
Oh, it's not important.
Okay.
Not that important. Okay. So, is this working? A little bit?
Yeah, it's working. You can try to get closer to it.
Yeah, so this is my doctoral thesis work. It'll probably be the last academic project I work on, but it's also the only one that I care about. If there's anything you'd like me to elaborate on at length after the presentation, please come talk to me. And I don't mind being interrupted if you have a clarification question. So, in the past, I've failed to adequately convey what my thesis work is about. For example, to one of the anonymous reviewers for this paper, hence what this project is. It will be a collaborative web system for arguing about certain kinds of questions in the most rigorous and fair way that we know of, that is deductive logic. It's a long-term software project. Aims to be a new kind of resource for making progress in arguments between certain people that are usually considered outside of math and science, for helping people find the fundamental sources of their disagreements with each other. And that's a special case of what I mean by progress. It's the main kind of progress. And for demonstrating deductive thinking to people who don't care about math. And it won't be just for people who know formal logic, because we'll see later in this talk that every proof requires a lot of clearly written natural language text. Although it's true that authoring a new argument on your own does require knowing logic, but it's not necessary to contribute to arguments or to criticisms. And finally, to be clear, I don't have a naive goal that some organization will someday use a system like this for actual dispute resolution. It's not a necessary criteria for the project's success for me. And just to be extra clear, what this project is not. So it's not concerned with descriptive modeling of argumentation, which from my limited familiarity appears to be the focus in the area of abstract argumentation systems. People tell me to look at a lot. So for example, I have no interest in modeling real legal reasoning or an assist in it. In contrast, I have lots of interest in depicting what real legal reasoning should be like in ideal environments with lots of time available. Which I'll note is, for existing severe criminal cases, you do have lots of time available. You have the rest of the convicted person's life to argue that they're innocent with sufficiently large probability. I mean, yeah. Right. Very rarely do governments actually completely declare someone innocent, even if they've thrown out their conviction, and then it continues hanging over your head and such. Yeah. Anyway, secondly, this project is not an application of the axiomatic method. It is not concerned. is not just concerned with developing general or elegant mathematical theories, and that includes theories that we call logics. And it's been surprisingly difficult for me to internalize this, because this is the majority of the work that people like us do and enjoy. I'm emphasizing this now because it's important for why classical first order logic is a good choice for this project. Specifically, it's easy to come up with concise and transparent first order simulations of other logics when the simulation only needs to be general enough for one proof. And I'm not talking about low-level simulations that just encode the syntax of the other logic. So natural simulations, but that only work for one proof. This is my oversimplified depiction of the workflow of the axiomatic method. I should have simplified it more, though, because all I really wanted to convey is that you usually start with your systems of axioms and semantics. The semantics is sometimes underspecified, and then you develop the theory by coming up with conjectures and proofs. And this is my oversimplified depiction for the workflow that I've been using. Again, I should have simplified it further. Really just want to convey that you start with an informal goal proposition that you want to argue for and an informal argument that concludes that proposition, and then construct an axiomatization and semantics specifically for turning that argument into a proof. The status of the project. The framework for implementing an the framework and implementation for authoring and reading proofs about vague and subjective issues is fairly well developed. Next implementation step is a web interface for authoring such proofs. I have some significant example arguments, which I'll mention in the coming slides. Only one of them is viewable online right now, but they will all be in a couple weeks. And the link to the one that's viewable now is in my paper. And I'd be very pleased to have more from any of you. And I'll do the work of writing it up in the right syntax for my code. So, the framework and implementation for collaboration on and argumentation using such proofs needs a lot of work and new ideas still. I've made some progress on criticizing such proofs, which I'll talk about today, but I don't think it yields a complete and usable dialogue system. Okay, so what are the questions that I'm suggesting this system should be used to argue about? They are contentious yes-no questions with ample time available for arguing. For these problems, I'm claiming there is good motivation to insist on deductive and formal reasoning. And conversely, I acknowledge that the motivation is largely absent for problems outside this domain. For example, we don't insist on formal proofs in mathematics because mathematicians usually don't deal with controversial questions where arguers have vested interest and relevant subjective beliefs and so on. In that environment, we are good at making progress on questions without having strict rules about how to proceed. And we don't insist on deduction when we don't have time for deduction, quite reasonably, because complete defeasible and heuristic arguments are better than incomplete deductive ones. So I'm not dissing defeasible reasoning. The restriction to yes-no questions is less important. I make it for two reasons. First, in my experience, an informal question is clear enough for deductive and formal reasoning when it can be approximated by a sequence of informal yes-no questions. And second, it's a useful simplification that so far hasn't been a significant restriction. All that said, the yes-no questions don't need to start out precise, because making a question more precise, precisifying it, as they say in the vagueness literature, it's still embarrassing to use the word, but it's so useful. So yeah. precisifying it, that'll be a special case of iteratively precisifying of the semantics of atomic symbols. And that's a central task of the kind of arguing that I'm advocating. Okay, it's been vague and abstract so far. So I'm going to give some concrete summaries of the examples that I've been working on. Oh yeah, there's that. This is the Berkeley gender bias lawsuit. Some of you are probably familiar with this. It's the classic example of Simpson's paradox, which is it's a subtle way that aggregate data can display a strong but non-causal correlation. In this case, the correlation was between gender and rejection rates, and UC Berkeley got sued for gender discrimination because of it.
What's UC?
University of California. So in my paper, I gave two arguments that the lawsuit should be dismissed. And now, both are more rigorous than the analyses given by other authors. A bunch of other people have written about it. And both technically use weaker assumptions, but they are less persuasive in an informal sense. And that sort of leads me to my first of a number of enumerated hypotheses. This is the saddest one, that though any argument can be formulated deductively and formally, they will tend to be less persuasive in that form. And the reason is not surprising, since every use of a generally unsound, feasible reasoning principle must be made into an assumption, and every unspoken assumption must be made explicit. Otherwise, your proof just won't complete. But there's a pleasant hypothesis as well, which is that bad arguments become much less persuasive than good ones do. So the second example is this fresh evidence appeal to overturn this guy, Leighton Hayes' murder conviction. He's a Canadian man convicted of murder in 2002 on very weak evidence. I believe he's probably innocent. Most of you have probably heard of like nonprofit organizations that work to exonerate wrongly convicted people, usually through DNA testing. The Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted is one of those. They're based in Toronto, like me. If you know the song about Reuben the Hurricane Carter, the Bob Dylan song, it was the founding members of AIDWIC who got him released. So they do good work. Anyway, that's the end of the plug for AIDWIC. I like them. They took up Hayes' case in 2010, and recently the Supreme Court of Canada, they won him a new trial based on new forensic analysis of some hair clipping evidence. And they were happy to give me thousands of pages of documents about the case, and I could talk about it all day. But in the end, I chose to focus my example on just that new forensic analysis. So currently, AIDWIC is hoping the government will decline to prosecute Hay again. If they do prosecute again, they probably won't continue to try to use the hair clipping evidence to argue for his guilt. But if they do, I'm going to get a real statistician to improve my argument or write a better one, and then AIDWIC will have him deliver the results as an expert witness. So something possibly might come out of it. Third example in my paper, in 1993, the Supreme Court of Canada heard a case in which a death with dignity group challenged the constitutionality of the section of Canada's criminal code that makes it illegal to assist another person in ending their life. So they litigated on behalf of a particular woman, Sue Rodriguez, who had the degenerative neurological condition ALS, like Steve Hawking, I think, has ALS too. And partly because of that, she had an especially good argument for why she should have access to assisted suicide. In Canada, also relevant, in Canada, the Supreme Court can issue a ruling called a suspended annulment, which would have allowed them to grant Sue Rodriguez the right to assisted suicide without granting it to anyone else. Nonetheless, she lost. So my argument is that the court ruled incorrectly, or more precisely, that the reasons they gave for the ruling did not justify their ruling. And if you take a look at it, you'll see that the gold proposition is really in that form. So it's a good example of making defeasible reasoning deductive. So I only consider the reasons they considered. Of course, there might be other reasons. So this example is fully formalized, and I've used a first-order theorem prover to prove the conclusion from the axioms, and a model finder to verify the consistency. It's less interesting mathematically than the other two, but for illustrating the proof authoring aspect of my project, I think it's the best of the three, so if you'll read only one. So that's it for the examples. So now I'm going to make a big deal out of a very simple definition. Language interpretation guide is just a dictionary for a first-order language. A mapping written by the author of a proof that assigns to each non-logical symbol some natural language text that informally defines what the author considers to be an intended or standard or acceptable interpretation of the symbol. That's it. So it's a simple interface between the formal syntax and the informal and vague semantics. And for this project, I think it's a minimal adequate interface. And that's not a trivial statement, because there is a still simpler interface. It's the one used in every formal proof in analytic philosophy that I can remember seeing that's about something not obviously identifiable as math. That interface only requires that there's some natural language text that accompanies the proof and that gives readers some idea of why the author has written the proof. And sometimes that includes an incomplete sketch of the intended semantics. So that is too simple an interface for this project, because the main purpose of this language interpretation guide is to compartmentalize vagueness. So that when there's a semantics problem between the author and a critic, it's possible to point to a local cause. A few more notes and details. For a symbol that an author intends to have highly subjective interpretations, the language interpretation guide's entry for it will often address the reader explicitly. For example, for a binary predicate symbol R, it would be an entry like, R of x, y holds if and only if you believe that such and such. Second, I've not yet specified any rules about the defining text attached to a symbol. To illustrate this, I'll note that a guide's entry for a symbol can refer to the interpretation of other symbols, and in my experience, it's often unavoidable. But technically, that allowance, taken to an extreme, can be exploited to completely thwart the goal of compartmentalizing vagueness. You could just make all symbols have the same language interpretation guide entry, which is a huge text that informally defines all of the symbols in terms of each other. So then the interface between syntax and semantics would be no stricter than what we're used to. So it is likely that some rules will be needed. But I hypothesize that mathematically precise rules won't be needed, and that the level of precision found, for example, in Wikipedia's extensive rules and guidelines, I don't know if any of you have looked, it's really extensive, that will suffice. And moreover, that there is no harm in postponing the development of the rules until we have more experience with actual usage. That said, if you already see some issues, I'd love to hear about it. Okay, so now we're going to use that simple definition of language interpretation guides and another very simple definition that I'm also going to make a big deal out of. A vaguely interpreted formal proof is given by a first order language L and a set of L sentences called the axioms. A language interpretation guide for the language. An L sentence designated the goal, and a computer checkable proof that the goal is a logical consequence of the axioms. And I'll note that the full definition, so this is a minimal definition, the full definition of has lemmas and claims are lemmas that don't have a proof, which means that requiring a computer checkable proof of the goal from the axioms, it only really technically demands that the whole thing parses and type checks, because you can assert lemmas freely, essentially. Of course, they can be then criticized by your critics.
Sorry, can you? These axioms are, of course, not logical axioms, but what are they precisely? What should we think about as a simple example? And what might be a goal?
They're axioms that just look like axioms in arithmetic, you know. So.
Well, it's hard to think about applications of reasoning in a legal system as with axioms like the Peano axioms or so. So
okay.
could you give one little example?
Sure. So. Okay, so this is the Sue Rodriguez proof, the one about that assisted suicide case. It's many sorted first order logic like all the examples. There's a sort for actions, and a sort for propositions, and a sort for people. That's it. And they each have this text underneath it. This is the language interpretation guide entry. And then there's some standard math stuff. And then there's predicate symbols like performed, that an action is actually performed. Satisfied, that a proposition is actually satisfied, and so on. So an example of an axiom, let's see. So this is sort of the most significant axiom that appears in it. It says, well, I mean, it takes a minute to unpack, but this is the thing that connects. It says that if a set of a set of ostensibly desired propositions does not justify criminalizing all of the actions that can achieve another condition. If there is an action that can accomplish that other condition, that has the property that, oh, I gotta scroll. Sorry. Well, I mean, have I helped at all? Like, without having to, I mean, you have to read it from top to bottom. So I'm going to keep going because I don't want to run out of time. I'm sorry, though, that I'm feeling that sense. so I don't know if I got through the previous thing. Oh, the one thing I didn't say is that also specified is an intended audience of critics. Yeah. And by the way, if I'll sometimes shorten language interpretation guide entry to just the semantics of the symbol. Okay. This is a notion I've alluded to already, but it's important enough to this project that I'd like to reinforce it, which is vagueness as plurality of intended interpretations. For a given vaguely interpreted proof, and for any author or critic P in the intended audience, many but not all models of the axioms would be acceptable to P if fully described and comprehended by P. So this, and by the way, this is obviously I know this is vague. It gets it can be made much more precise if you restrict to finite models of a bounded size. Anyway, in this sense, model theory is more fundamental to this project than proof theory. So I have an encouraging bit of experience to share related to vagueness as plurality of intended interpretations, which is that in all of my examples so far, there's been no need for infinite or even arbitrarily large structures to interpret the parts of the language that are not standard mathematics. And that brings me to my fourth hypothesis, which is there won't be any such need, at least for discussion questions that, let's say, a majority of people think are important to society, which admittedly is not all the questions that I or any of you are interested in. Okay, so how do you criticize a vaguely interpreted proof? So I said earlier this project, I meant to say anyway, aims to serve as a normative model for rigorous, fair, and civil argumentation. And all those properties require a careful design of a protocol for criticizing vaguely interpreted formal proofs and responding to such criticisms. I'm giving a very minimal definition here. The definition of my paper is a bit richer, and the implemented definition I expect will need to be richer still. And I'm very open to ideas on that. So fix a vaguely interpreted formal proof, and let's assume you're in the intended audience that it specifies. So to evaluate an L sentence, L being the language of the proof, A, means to make a tentative commitment that all, some, or none of your personal intended L interpretations satisfy A. The author communicates information about their personal L interpretations primarily through their language interpretation guide. And ideally, the axioms are not necessary for that communication. And I'll have more about that in the next slide. So you should read the language interpretation guide and use it to evaluate each axiom independently for yourself. And the independently part is significant. That's the part that's usually not required in proofs that come up in analytic philosophy. So this notion of personal L interpretations, it's of course a vague collection and a private one, but it's a vague private collection that's always bounded above by, here's my graphic, by a precise public collection, which is roughly the collection of all structures that satisfy the axioms you accept and falsify the axioms you reject. I say roughly because you can also say that an axiom is satisfied by some but not all of your intended interpretations. So if we design the system right, the hope is that in a slow dialogue with poor communication and poor cooperation, that precise upper bounding collection slowly gets appreciably smaller and smaller as the dialogue progresses, until it's close enough that it no longer matters that you can't conceive of the same set of interpretations that your opponent is conceiving of. So the first of the two most important kinds of criticisms, which are the only two I'll be talking about in detail, a semantics criticism. This means you submit an axiom A and at least one non-logical symbol S that occurs in A, and the criticism means that the semantics for S is not clear enough for you to evaluate A. Simple. Of course, you should try to resolve this criticism using informal communication, but of course you won't always be able to. For example, if the author is knowingly engaging in equivocation or something like that. In that case, you should submit a new sentence, call it B, which is interpreted by the author as the question, is B satisfied by all, some, or none of your personal interpretations? Yeah. I have an example, so probably won't have a time for the example, but it's fine. Okay, so a semantic criticism is well, it's the vaguely interpreted proofs analog of asking a person to define a word they're using. And the sentences A and B, they communicate how much more precise you need the semantics to be. A complication for the goal of making progress in an argument between people is that to formulate that sentence B in the way you want to, you might have to extend the language in a non-conservative way. In that case, I'll say you get a copy of the language interpretation guide for which you write and control the entries for the new symbols. So this is the vaguely interpreted proofs analog of broadening the scope of an argument. And I mean, it's a complication because I don't really know how to tell the difference between broadening the scope of an argument, technically, and stalling. It's hard to tell in informal argumentation, obviously, sometimes. So that's why it's a complication. I mean, ideally, the author accepts your extension of the interpretation guide and adds it to their proof, along with either accepting B or rejecting it, or saying that it's independent, essentially. And what I haven't answered is if they don't accept the extension, well, we should at least record that they rejected it. And perhaps later, with more experience, we'll see that something more sophisticated should and needs to be done in this case. Again, open to suggestions. So the second main kind of criticism is applicable when the proof is sufficiently clear. So first, another simple definition. Rejecting an axiom A means the language interpretation guide is precise enough for you to evaluate A, and that you make a tentative commitment that at least one of your personal interpretations falsifies A. Similarly, accepting an axiom A means all your personal interpretations satisfy A. So then a subjective criticism is when you reject an axiom A and either accept its negation or tentatively commit to the independence of A, which means A is also satisfied by at least one of your interpretations. So you'll take that latter option, for example, when A is a simplifying assumption that you're unwilling to accept. I'm going to go till 56 after, which is like 40 minutes after I start. Okay, local refutability. I've been alluding to this definition for a while now without naming it. So this is a property of ideal vaguely interpreted proofs. It can be partially met. So a proof is locally refutable with respect to its specified audience if every cooperatively reasoning member of the audience can criticize it without raising a semantics criticism. So 2V just means it's clear. But a little bit more specific, as a consequence of the procedure for evaluating vaguely interpreted formal proofs, we have the property that each axiom can be evaluated using just language interpretation guide and without needing to look at the other axioms. And I think that's a very desirable property. I can tell you where this definition came from. It was after a frustrating attempt to explain for myself what was wrong with Gödel's ontological proof, the existence of God, whether he intended it to be that or not. So eventually I arrived at the same conclusion as another author, but about which of the axioms is most problematic, but it took much too long. And it took so long because no one who has put forward the argument has ever given an adequate description of their intended semantics for the primitive symbols. So because of this, to criticize the argument, one must essentially criticize all the possible semantics that might have been acceptable to that author or presenter of the argument. And that's unfair to your critics. So I think that striving for a certain degree of local refutability, or whatever you want to call it, helps prevent that kind of thing. And yeah, so this is obviously an inoperable definition because people can lie. But it's precise enough that I'm comfortable making the following hypothesis, which is you should recognize a natural language argument X as good if and only if it can be written as a locally refutable, vaguely interpreted proof of X from axioms, each of which you accept. So I don't know if that's really debatable or trivial. I'd like to hear your thoughts either way. So here examples of some arguments that I'm fairly convinced can't be turned into satisfactory or even moderately compelling locally refutable proofs. So Soriety's arguments, that's obvious because it's sort of what they're intended for. As I already mentioned, Gödel's ontological proof. Fitch's knowability paradox, which I was happy to introduce to by Carrara and Sergio and Shifi? I don't know. And I have draft write-ups for these three, if you're interested. And of course, if you have suggestions for more. So I'll probably stop it there. The only thing you missed out on is a toy example of criticizing a vaguely interpreted proof that nobody should ever get married. And it's a nice argument for demonstrating equivocation. So those are the axioms, and then the conclusion is nobody should ever get married. So the remaining slides are just to go through that. Some recent work. Two policy arguments, still deductive. First is, in the United States, that health warnings on cigarette packs should have been mandated in the early 1950s, quite a bit before they actually were, based mostly on the first two major observational studies that were published in the year 1950. And the second is, independently of the argument I told you about earlier, that Canada should institute a system for assisted suicide, like you guys have here. And that's the most that's the most demanding argument I've done so far. Okay.
Have you guys decided who wants to come in first?
No.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm going first, right?
Yeah, why not?
Okay.
So pick on the anyhow.
So I will have some questions about things that actually weren't precisely mentioned during the talk, but were in the papers. Maybe that's bad or maybe that's good. So I've got one specific question and some other more general stuff concerning the sort of methodological remarks and motivations you provide us with in the paper. And the specific thing is, you write in one place that it is vital to think of models and the satisfaction relation as the fundamental logical concepts as opposed to validity. And the question is, I don't really see the opposition, since it seems to me that when you say that, for example, you've got some fixed signature, some vocabulary sigma, and you say that the formula is valid with this signature, it means that in all models from the class of this signature, models satisfy the formula. Or when you say that the formula is valid relative to some set of formulas, which is just the meaning of the consequence. So that's my first question. I don't really see the opposition between validity and models and satisfaction. So it would be very nice if we could develop on that.
Can I answer that question before you move on?
Yes, of course.
So maybe it's a vague sentence too. So it might be I'm saying something that's not significant, but I guess just because it's necessary to be evaluating, or I think it is, to be evaluating a system with a precise structure, precise interpretation in mind, as precise as possible.
And where does the opposition with validity come?
I don't know. I guess that's just maybe there's no opposition. with validity.
It still remains unclear to me.
Okay. It's not important to me. I'll take it out.
Other things you say here are about some oppositions between mathematics, science, and precise stuff on one hand, and socially relevant stuff with vagueness, subjectiveness, and uncertainty as some major factors. And you are writing that, for example, in math, we usually axiomatize structures sufficiently precisely at the beginning of our reasoning when a new area of mathematics is developing, whereas in reasoning about social issues, one must delay the precisifying of vague definitions. So, on one hand, it seems to me that actually in mathematics exactly the same process is going on. And take examples like computability,
I
probability
agree
or
with this.
calculus.
Yeah.
I think it isn't the case that when we try to get a grasp of some notion that seems important in science or in life in general, that we are trying to axiomatize it. No, first we've got some intuitive observation, we learn something like deductively, and then axiomatizations comes later.
So,
doesn't it? So yeah. So question is it really is there really such a difference between socially relevant stuff and mathematics?
So I don't think there is, and I think it's just a quantitative one, really, which is that as opposed to something categorical, which is so. Which is that in reasoning about these things with high levels of vagueness and subjectiveness, you have to be like making them more precise in the process of a single argument. And the only time I know that happening in mathematics is in set theory, when people are, trying to give an argument for like why they think the continuum hypothesis is true or something like that. So of course, over a long term, yeah, we're getting more precise definitions, but day to day, we're working with a fixed set of definitions when we start our reasoning.
Yeah, but after the area of mathematics has developed, not when it's developing. That was my point. That actually.
So that's bad choice of words.
Okay. And you also wrote one thing that I have doubt about, that in social stuff it may happen that the question has different answers depending on how it is specified, as opposed to mathematics in the text. So for example, let's take a question, is Gödel sentence true, or is equivalent question, is beyond arithmetic consistent? And 4 different answers. No, not probably in PA. Yes, probably in ZFC. Yes, in the standard model. No, not in some non-standard models. So again, the same thing, that we can provide some examples from mathematics that you give a question that seems precise, and depending on how you actually specify it, you get also different answers. So would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't intend. I mean, I don't think I intended to suggest that that's a difference between. I mean,
Okay, so that's maybe a wrong impression.
Yeah. So.
And do I still have some, like 1 minute?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I would, because you want to model argumentation and the processes in which we try to persuade us. So, if you allow me, I would like to recall an idea from Jaroslaw from 1970s that seems forgotten, and I think it's actually interesting that when we try to model what does it mean that, for example, we got a convincing argument for some statement, and the idea is called experimental logic and was intended to model experimenting with logics, but it could be used for processes of persuading others. So we've got a say recursive predicate that the intuitive reading of which is at time t, the sentence with the Gödel number x has a justification with the Gödel number y, and justification is supposed to become a proof in some moment. And within experimental logic, we say that a formula is recurring if and only if for every moment of time there will be some time afterwards such that there will be a justification for this sentence. And the formula is stable if we get a good justification for some sentence. So if there is a justification such that there will be a moment of time that afterwards we accept it as a justification. And then experimental logic is called convergent if those two sets of natural numbers coincide. And an interesting thing that might not be very surprising for some of you is that the sets of theorems of any convergent experimental logics are precisely delta 0 to the sets of natural numbers. And so that's maybe a thing to look in if you like it. Thank you.
Thanks. What's the author's name? What's the author's name?
Excuse me.
What's the author's name?
Oh, Jaroslaw.
Thanks. Now we have one more comment by Gilman. Okay, so truncate this. The author's paper, as you've all just seen, focuses on uses of formal logic primarily in law. In what follows, however, I'm going to comment about the not as much discussed application of this kind of methodology in policy analysis. So the two main sections of the paper have to do with legal arguments, but they don't actually require much of formal logic per se. Indeed, the author himself says, writing papers and blog posts as mediums for expressing things, it's an easier medium to work in, and far superior if one is interested in persuading your public rather than trying just to sort of get the truth, if you will. So much of law and public policy debate is really like that. And so, although there isn't much sort of by way of logic in the paper, and doesn't have to be. You know, we're trying to do things that are applied. It doesn't just have to be logic. I want to ask, could there be more logic in this paper? Or could we be working towards a kind of formal system? So in that regard, I wanted to mention some problems that some people have seen for approaching policy analysis as a kind of formal system. And so these are critics of what are called the rational deductive ideal in policy. So that's where we try and devise a logical system that can be used then to derive what the policy should be given a certain collection of facts and values. And the two primary critics that I have in mind here is the late David Braybrook and the 97-year-old Charles E. Lindblom, who's a Yale economist.
I'm a critic of this too.
Okay, good. So, although they're not against using mathematical tools in policy analysis like operations research, they were skeptical about using formal methods in trying to regiment policy analysis. And they confronted this on sort of 5 fronts. But I want to focus in on one of their criticisms of why it was going to be impossible to actually formalize something like policy analysis. And this is where, in policy analysis, or debates in policy analysis, there are conflicts among values. And what I mean by that, and what they meant by that, was that we value things based on whether we have other things. So, for instance, back in the 1930s in the US, people just didn't think about spending money in order to secure Social Security, or spend money on ensuring that they were going to be secured into the future. It wasn't until the government instituted a baseline of Social Security that people thought it was actually going to be worth spending money on that. So you end up getting a set of values only after a certain other fact is obtained. Now, when we look at the notion of local refutability, the author says, we say that a vaguely interpreted form of proof is locally refutable if no member of the intended audience raises semantic or rigor criticisms when reviewing it. A locally refutable proof has the desirable property that by using the language interpretation guide, any member of the audience can evaluate each of the axioms independently of the other axioms. Now, if values have this kind of structure where we can't really separate them, then this is going to be a kind of problem for applying this notion of local refutability in policy analysis, because after all, the language interpretation guide is still something that we're using in natural language. It's still ultimately something in natural language. And if we're not able to actually separate values, we're not going to be able to capture those values as independent axioms. There's always going to be there will always have to be a kind of holistic interpretation of the whole thing. So, however, having said all of that, I still see a great deal of value in this project. From my experience of talking with politicians, now socially, it's not like I get sat down in front of rooms of politicians and tell them what to do. No, just having drinks with them or something. They tend to see logic in a kind of, well, that seems like a lot of work for nothing kind of way. But I think we would all agree, and I think they would also agree, that as a regulator of argument construction, it is very useful. And I think what the end goal of this of Dustin's project, being this kind of wiki version of making proofs, to be an excellent way of bringing people into using formal methods that aren't going to be or haven't been exposed to it before. And so in that way, I think we can think about complex things deeply, because we'll have a nice regular and regimented structure to work in, instead of just thinking about simple things superficially, which sometimes we do as magicians when we approach complex sociological issues. So thank you.
I'll be interested in talking to you about the values then. Yeah, I guess what exactly you mean by separated values and such.
Yeah, it was mainly, it was about that questions of how much you value something or whether you value something at all may depend on whether you have other things, perhaps other things of certain kind of maybe a different value. And so if you're trying to sort of set up axioms that are going to deal with one term, that deal with one certain kind of value, like public housing or full employment, you may not be able to separate that from, well, if I go after full employment, how much inflation am I going to have to eat in order to do that? And so they're inextricably linked.
I agree
so
with
we're
that.
not going to be able to sort of axiomatize them separately, axiomatize them separately.
I agree that you can't always separate them, but not that you can't write your language in such a way that it's still locally feasible.
Questions? Cool. Let's start with the back.
I had a question about the motivation for the project. I didn't read the paper, but I'm curious why if you could say more about why you're distancing yourself from the work that's done in AI and law and argumentation and so on. Not that I don't love doom-style argumentation, but the people who are doing that have very sophisticated models of disputes where people can interact on the web and identify points of disagreement. And so I'm curious to know why you don't embrace that and what you want to do instead.
Yeah, I'm not intending to distance myself. I like Douglas Walton's work, for example. He works in the field of informal logic.
Right, and so the argumentation people try to swallow that. I don't know whether he wants to be swallowed.
Oh. I guess, yeah, I'm not intending to distance myself. I have an idea of what I need, and I'm not finding the solutions in that work.
Okay.
But on the other hand, like I said in the talk, I've really been focusing on examples and just writing proofs, which are like a first step in a dialogue. So I haven't gotten that far into the literature on dialogue systems.
There's work by especially Trevor Bench-Capon, who I think is based on Walton's work in modeling formal disputes about policy disagreements. I think you'd be interested in.
Maybe forget it. Can you formulate the question within 2 sentences?
10 seconds.
Okay.
So maybe a way to summarize my questions is about you suggesting you requested something better than proof. No, VI proof said something. Maybe you could have another name instead of proof. Maybe it should be augmentation. because there is a distinction between argumentation and demonstration. It's not the same, but it should be very longer to explain about this, so we have time maybe during the coffee break to see this.
Okay, we'll talk.
Clayton, you had a question? No, who else? Luke had a question? Oh, Matthew had a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was a little bit confused about the practicalities of. So all the examples you have now implemented were written by you, right? So nobody else has used it. But you imagine that they learn the syntax, and that they, for instance, you need to know the difference, for instance, between an action and a set of actions, for instance, to be able to write these things.
An action and a set of actions.
I'm just trying extracting information from what you showed when you looked at this website. Like I don't know how you write these things, what the syntax is, or I'm just trying to gauge what kind of like level of programming skill you're asking of a potential user of this system in the future.
Yeah, I don't want them to have to know any programming at all. I mean, I want it to just be a web system. You have to be able to write formula in your language, but and then you have to be able to write, the semantics.
But the kind of stuff you showed in the browser, you would need to be able to write things like that. This would be.
That's generated from something simpler.
Wait, what?
It's generated from something simpler.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is natural language, or?
No, it's just like, simple data types, like a sentence data type.
I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Sorry about that. Oh, yeah.
Look, I'm sort of wondering, it would be nice to see some examples, right? Because I feel like, when you teach first-order logic to philosophers, really what you want them to be able to do is, here's an argument in the natural language, formalize, What are the premises? What is the conclusion? Give me your proof. What are the predicates all about? And then when they say, why am I doing this? You say, well, it's not a bad idea, because then you can figure out if you don't like a conclusion, you can figure out what maybe it's invalid. You can figure that out, or maybe you can figure out what premise it is that you don't like, or whether there's equivocation and so on. So that's why you're doing this stuff, right? Now, of course, when you're trying to teach this, there's sort of an element of creativity that comes in, right? So I'm sort of wondering, are you able to sort of bypass that creativity in some way because you have some algorithms for doing this? Or what is it that you do different from what we're teaching, our first year students of logic when we teach them how to formalize arguments?
Oh, I didn't say it would be a tool for teaching. I just said demonstrating, use of deduction. Like it's just proofs that aren't about arithmetic and such, but are about things that, matter to a lot of people.
But isn't that what we're trying to do when we teach first year logic? Take an argument in the natural language. Let's try to see what it's all about. Is it valid? Is it invalid? Spell out a model for invalidity. If it's valid, give me the proof. What are the premises? And is that what you're after too, or is there?
Yeah, I'd love to see the kind of teaching material that you're talking about.
Oscar, natural arguments. Nice collection of natural arguments that are, once they know how to do first order logic, you can just throw it at them and say, okay, formalize. Let's see where we go with this. Half of them are valid, half of them are invalid. When it's about religion, it's always invalid. That was sort of thing. But,
so that's, I guess I'm not interested in the task of demonstrating converting not that I'm not interested, no. I guess I'm not trying to say that this is useful for teaching people how to convert a natural language argument to a formal argument. That's not what I meant. I just meant it's a demonstration that's not, toy examples.
No, I do agree when a lot of what happens in these textbooks is that your English arguments are completely artificial. Your arguments in the English language, right, are completely artificial. So I do think you have to make that step to teach the students how to take real life arguments in newspapers.
Yeah, I agree.
And so on. And it's hard to teach that because there is a certain amount of creativity that comes in. It's hard to get that across. So I was sort of wondering whether you had tricks or algorithms, that could help them get there.
No, I wasn't. I wasn't planning on replacing that kind of teaching. No, not at all. I just, yeah.
Okay, good. Let's thank the speaker. We have 15 minutes of coffee break, so we'll meet back here at 22. 4.